Aikin, and I wanted to make sure you are aware that Tom Fehring from the Historic Preservation Commission is also here. I'll be doing most of the speaking, but Tom did most of the technical stuff that will make our presentation come to life today. So thank you, Tom, for all your assistance on this. You should know that the Historic Preservation Commission is a government agency of Whitefish Bay and is different from the Whitefish Bay Historical Society, which is a private 501c3. And Tom and I sit on the Historic Preservation Commission. Thank you all. If you can't hear me, put up a B sign, like volume. I think all of us that lived in Whitefish Bay have known for a long time that we lived in a community that had something special to offer, that we had something unique here, but we weren't exactly, didn't know that much about it. In 2010, the state of Wisconsin State Historical Society came to Whitefish Bay and did something called an intensive survey. And that involved taking a look at all of the structures in Whitefish Bay, about 5,000 of them, to determine their historical value. And as a result of that 2-year project, they came out with a 400-page report available at the library, online, and in Village Hall that says that about 60%, or about 3,000 structures in Whitefish Bay are considered historically valuable, or historic properties. Now, what's the definition of a historic property? The baseline definition is that it has to be 50 years old, and it has to be pretty much intact. It has to look like it looked when it was originally built. If it's been modified or changed in a significant way, it begins to lose some of its historic value. Now, the Historical Society categorized properties basically 3 ways. One was the 3,000 properties that are considered historic, but that alone doesn't convey any special status to any of these properties. There was a second category of about 107 properties that were determined to be what they call individually eligible for placement on the National Register of Historic Places. The National Register of Historic Places is a federal government entity. Properties that are listed on it qualify for income tax credits for the homeowners who make repairs or improvements to those properties. In that survey, they found slightly over 100 properties qualify for that designation, that right now they can begin to take advantage of those tax credits. Many of those properties, as you would imagine, include those properties on Lake Drive or Wilshire or Circle Drive, but they're scattered throughout Whitefish Bay. Many of them are not on the east side, on the west, and on the north sides of Whitefish Bay. And then there was a third category. The state determined that there were 12 residential historic districts in Whitefish Bay, and they included about 2,000 homes. That's about half the housing stock in Whitefish Bay. And they categorized it into 12 different historic districts. The smallest one, right up here, called the Lake Heights Historic District, only has 11 homeowners. This one right here, the Lake Crest Historic District, it has 400 homeowners. They vary in size throughout the community. As you can see, they're scattered throughout our community. They're not plugged all on Lake Drive. They're all through our community. Now, if these 12 historic districts were placed on the National Register of Historic Places, all of the homeowners in those districts, with only a couple of exceptions, would all qualify for federal and state income tax credits for any repairs or maintenance they would do to their properties. We're talking about painting, we're talking about tuck pointing, roofing, window replacements, heating and ventilation equipment repairs and replacements. We're talking about the things that we do to our homes almost every few years to our properties. And you would get 25% back in tax credits that if you did not consume it all in one tax year, it would carry over into future years. So the Historic Preservation Commission is interested in having the village pursue historic preservation status and creating historic districts, proposed historic districts, through the State Historic Society, through the federal government, that would help qualify our homeowners for those tax credits. Now, when we get to the question period, I hope someone will ask me, what's the downside for having a historic property? The short answer to that question is there is no downside, none. But I can talk to you in a little bit more detail about that when we get to the question period. Now, when Tom and I were working on this book that will come out later this year about Whitefish Bay, we put together a first draft and had it done by October. And we were looking at it and said, well, this is okay, but what's missing? And we just put in all the houses that we've selected and chosen that we wanted to highlight. What's missing here? And then it hit us. Oh yeah, you don't know anything about the people that lived in those houses. And that's where the stories are. So we had a deadline in December, and we blew through that deadline as we began to do more and more research to find out about who the people were that lived in some of these grand homes and not so grand homes in Whitefish Bay that helped contribute to our community. And I want to home in today on a handful of people. But some of the people that have been in Whitefish Bay may be names that you're familiar with. There's Leo Goldman. He and his father, Abraham, opened Goldman's department store in Mitchell Street 111 years ago. And Goldman's was known for the unique wares that it had, and its catering to what could probably kindly be called portly customers. They had sweatpants that weren't extra large, or double extra large, but 10 times extra large. They sold dress shirts that had 24-inch necks, and they sold bras that were 56 double Fs. So these were some stout people that were their customers. But Goldman's passed away a few years ago, and so did his wife, but they owned and lived in Whitefish Bay. Also Joe Zilber, a well-known developer, developed around the country. But one of the things he did is he built a rocket gantry at Cape Canaveral. He built a heating plant north of the Arctic Circle in Alaska. And he put in 15 dummy silos in North Dakota to cool the Soviet satellites during the Cold War. He did a lot of interesting things. You all know about Herman Eline, member of the Eline family that owned the Schlitz Brewing Company. Herman built the Grand Mansion on Lake Drive. But he was an important industrialist in his own right. He was the founder of the Levine Gear Company, which made gears for all kinds of motorized vehicles, such as cars and trucks. There's Harry Grant, who was publisher of the Milwaukee Journal. There's Carl Hertzfeld, who founded the Boston store. There's Joseph Heil, who was the founder of the Heil Company and was the governor of Wisconsin. There's Curtis Rader, who was head of a malting company that was the largest in the United States, serving the beer industry. And now Grant, in his will, was the seed money that helped establish Greater Lutheran Memorial Hospital out in Wauwatosa. There was Joseph Padway. He was an attorney who was a socialist, and socialism was a popular political party in Milwaukee in the early days. But he became involved in both Wisconsin and federal legislation that was sort of the forerunner for the New Deal. It included legislation having to do with minimum wage and labor union rights and unemployment compensation. Padway was the father of a lot of that legislation. We have a lot of sports stars in this town. Craig Counsell is probably the best known baseball player who's now the field manager for the Milwaukee Brewers. We've had 3 skating champions from this community. Sally Ann Kaminsky was a gold medal winner in a skating competition called synchronized skating. Angela Zuckerman was a speed skater who went to the Olympics in Norway and in France in the 1990s. And then there was a guy named Tom Weissel, who is an exceptional athlete, who set national records for his age groups in 3 different sports: speed skating, cycling, and downhill skiing. And he went off to San Francisco, got in on the ground floor of the Silicon Valley boom, and now he's a very wealthy man and sits on the boards of the museums of modern art in both New York and San Francisco, and once had an art collection of 700 pieces, which he donated to the museums. Russell Barr Williamson was an important architect. He was Frank Lloyd Wright's right-hand man, was involved in many of his projects. But then he came to Milwaukee. He had built his home on Oakland Avenue, just north of Hampton. But probably one of the most important achievements that he had was not a house that he built, but a four-stall latrine that he designed during World War II, because the ones that existed were falling apart in the heat and humidity of the Pacific, and they couldn't carry these things and they were falling apart. He designed one that was portable and durable. He helped win the war. Talking about architects, Armin Frank was an important architect that lived in this community. He designed the Casa del Lago, which is the Italian-style villa that's at the intersection of Silver Spring and Lake Drive, right on the lake. He designed that for his mother in 1927. His mother was a grand niece of Captain Frederick Pabst, and her mother was involved in the salacious sex scandal and it received national attention. But the people I want to talk about this afternoon in a little bit more detail were people that I think have some of the most interesting life stories. They were people, some of whom were famous, and some of whom who were infamous. But I think they were all characters. I think they were all interesting people. First one I want to talk about is Frederick Gallus Isenring. He was our first village president, and he was a real estate developer. You could say that because of his civic activities, his real estate activities, his business involvements in the community, that he probably did more for the development of Whitefish Bay as it is today than any other single individual in Whitefish Bay's history. He was born around 1860, and at an early age, he had a nose for money. He bought a plot of land on the lake for about $1,600, and then 10 years later, he sold it to Pabst Brewing Company for $20,000, for 1,200% return. Then, he managed the Pabst Resort and ran it for the company for several years, living in a house on the property. He also continued to be involved in real estate development, especially to the south side of the Pabst Resort, from Henry Clay to the south, and several subdivisions are named for Fred Isenring. Now, he was one of the individuals that was involved in the incorporation of Whitefish Bay as a municipality in 1892. Whitefish Bay was the first suburb that was created in Milwaukee County as a suburb of Milwaukee. Its destiny, however, was at that point was uncertain as to the type of community it would be, because commercial interests were sort of pushing Whitefish Bay's future in a different direction than it eventually turned out. One of the fortunate things that happened for Whitefish Bay was the Depression of 1893, which up until that time was the worst depression that the United States had ever experienced. The one in 1929 was worse. But for Fred Isenring, it was a terrible thing, because the bottom fell out of the real estate market, and he began to have some serious troubles. For Whitefish Bay, it was a good thing, because the commercial interests began to recede, their power began to diminish, and the newly created village board began to control the destiny of Whitefish Bay and its future development. We would now today, if the Depression had not happened, be maybe a railroad community like West Milwaukee or Butler. We would have railroad yards in our community, as long as railroads were at least in vogue. We would have a state fair in this community. We would have a quarry next to our community. All these commercial developments were occurring around the 1800s when Whitefish Bay was just beginning to develop as a suburb. And the Depression stopped a lot of that type of commercial development. Now, Fred, when he was the village president, he was the first village president from 1892 to 1893. He then became a member of the state legislature. He was a supervisor on the Milwaukee County Board, and then he ran for sheriff. And he was the Milwaukee County Sheriff from, when were the years? From 1895 to 1896. Now, because of the problems in the real estate business, he had serious financial problems. And when he left the sheriff's office, it was discovered through an audit that $20,000 worth of funds that were collected from foreclosures by the sheriff's office were missing. Fred was asked to account for that. He was directed to appear in court, and when he did not appear, a warrant was issued for his arrest. And deputies were going to arrest him and went to his home. And right before Christmas in 1899, according to his wife, he left on a business trip for Fond du Lac, never to be seen again. Fred disappeared, and nobody has ever determined his whereabouts. Now, his wife said he was going on a business trip, but Tom had a phone conversation with one of Fred Isenring's great-grandsons a year or so ago, in which, according to the family lore, he didn't actually go on a business trip. He went to an outhouse, and then he disappeared. His home was right by Schoolhouse Park. So we've always wondered, since Schoolhouse Park is an empty lot, is it possible that Fred Isenring fell into the outhouse and his bones are buried there along with $20,000 in cash? It would be great to find out. It would be great to know. That's one of the mysteries of Fred Isenring. Now, Fred had a real nice house. This house was built on Fleetwood, right across from Schoolhouse Park, in 1892. After he died, a friend of his, Dr. Thaddeus Williams, moved the house to the corner of Sylvan and Marlboro, just south of the fire department. And that house was raised in 2009. It sort of became a duplex and then it became an apartment. And when it was raised, Tom and I were able to salvage a stained glass window that was, I'm not sure where the stained glass was, but it is hanging in the library. Now, the Isenring family was an important family for Whitefish Bay. Gallus' father, who came here in 1850s with his wife, they were immigrants from Switzerland, and they had met on the boat, not married. They came here, built a house here. Now, this is not their house, but this is where they lived at 808 East Lakeview. And this house includes, in parts of it, the original foundation and the root cellar of Gallus Isenring's house. So part of it still exists in this house. Now, this house was subsequently purchased by, what was the gentleman's name? Ralph Friedman. Ralph Friedman was the owner of the Schuster's department store, and he was the grandson of Edward Schuster, who had founded the department store. So when Ralph Friedman bought this house, he did some extensive remodeling. Now, Fred had a nephew named Wynad. And you would think that the next Isenring after Fred would not be entrusted with public money. But in fact, Wynad became the village treasurer. And he served from 1917 until 1941 when he died. And Wynad was also the founder of the three partners of the Whitefish Bay State Bank. It was the first bank on the North Shore. And during the Depression, it was the first bank in Milwaukee County to become part of the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, the agency that was created to protect depositors' accounts. And he lived in this house. Originally, it's on Lexington. And it's at, what is it? 1036 East Lexington. And later, he built this house. And this one is at 1009 Henry Clay. Both houses still standing. Now, the fourth generation of Isenring was Warren Isenring, Wynad's son. Warren went to Marquette University, got a degree in engineering, and opened a business on Silver Spring. First, it was a small repair shop. Then he began to start selling some electronics, and he became a very successful and prosperous businessman with a showroom for TVs, washing machines, stoves, and other appliances in the Gottfredson building, which is the building in the 300 block that includes businesses right now like Pete's Jewelry, Hounds Around Town, Great Frame Up, the new restaurant, Moxie's, that beautiful old building. He had the entire floor of that building while he was in business. He lived with his wife right here at 739 East Beaumont Avenue. This is a house that was built, that was designed by Ernest Flagg. Ernest Flagg was a very prominent New York architect who was involved in a number of important construction projects around the country, including the Singer Tower, which was the 45-story skyscraper in New York City, which at the time was the tallest skyscraper in the world when it was built. It no longer exists, but late in life, Ernest Flagg decided that he wanted to begin to design residential properties, and he came up with a design that involved a flagstone design that has 14 structures, 14 flag homes in Whitefish Bay. Now I mentioned Dr. Thaddeus Warsaw Williams was a good friend of Fred Isenring's, and he, Tom and I, for a long time, were trying to figure out who this guy was. We knew who, he existed. We knew that he was the village's second president after Fred Isenring, served for 2 years. We knew that he was the village's first health officer. We knew that he called himself a doctor. And we knew he had been involved in the publication of some unusual books, which I'll tell you about in just a second. But we were trying to understand the personality as much as we could, and trying to be as fair as we can to Dr. Williams. That's still somewhat of a question mark. We know he was a good family man because he originally was from Kentucky. He moved to Whitefish Bay. His sister and brother-in-law passed away, leaving 5 children. And the 5 children that were spread around the family, he took in 2 of them and raised them to adulthood. We knew he was a good civic leader because he was one of the people involved in village's incorporation. We know that he was one of the original village board trustees, and we know that he later became village president. And as a physician, we know that he was a compassionate caregiver. In Tom's book, Chronicles of Whitefish Bay, there's a story about a young girl, 14 years old, a niece of Wynette Isenring, who went to the Methodist Church on Silver Spring for a Sunday social, was about to sit down when one of her schoolmates pulls the chair out from under her as she's sitting down, and she had a serious back injury, spinal cord injury as a result. And Dr. Williams treated it. And he seemed to be a very compassionate caregiver. He seemed to practice, from her description of her treatment, a form of chiropractic. He developed a type of therapy where a railroad was being built alongside the home they lived on, near Meadow by the high school. And the railroad workers would take her, have her stand on their feet, tie ropes around, and then goose step across the street so that her legs would move. And eventually she was able to walk again. And this was, an innovative form of therapy that Dr. Williams came up with. But we also know that during this time, that the practice of medicine in the United States, as one historian called it, a chaotic free-for-all. The doctor title was basically one that you just assumed by yourself. There was no licensing that existed in the United States. There was no medical standards. Medical schools, there was good ones, and there were others that were just diploma mills. And what was really sad about the medical system in the United States during this time period is that all the innovation was taking place in Europe, and it was being rejected by doctors in the United States who were being very provincial about the practice of medicine. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the Supreme Court Justice, his father was a physician, and he famously said that when Europeans were using the practice of science to develop new medical breakthroughs. He asked once, what science have to do with medicine? So that reflected an attitude that existed in the United States in terms of the practice of medicine. We don't know if Dr. Williams shared those attitudes, but we know he believed at least one thing that was a conventional wisdom of the day, but has proved to be suspect. I should mention that Dr. Williams moved to this house here on Sylvan Avenue, 942 East Sylvan, and built this home, which is now a duplex, called it the Pines. But when he became the village health officer, he wrote a booklet, a 15-page pamphlet, and had it distributed throughout Whitefish Bay with this unwieldy title. Now, what was spermaria? Well, spermaria, anything that has "ria" in it, at the end of the word can't be good. Diarrhea, diarrhea, gonorrhea, spermaria, it's something bad. Well, in the medical convention, wisdom of that time, spermaria was any male emissions, voluntary or involuntary, outside of marital relations. And this was supposed to cause significant physical and mental damage to the males. And one treatment was castration. So, not when I checked, but it's not clear if there was an epidemic of spermaria during the Whitefish Bay at the time that Dr. Williams felt the need to distribute this pamphlet. We also don't know how Dr. Williams treated this condition. We'll have to continue to do more research on that. Now, he also wrote a book. He also wrote a 300-page novel with this unwieldy title. He was into big, long, strange titles. And this is sort of a fantasy. It's about some American Indians in the Southwest that were into human sacrifice. And when the sacrifices were done, the blood of the victims drained through the soil into an underground river. And the underground river was transformed into a magic elixir. And so there was a high priest, and during an earthquake, the high priest and his new bride ran into a cavern where the underground river flowed. During the earthquake, his new bride became a victim. She was cut in half. Well, the high priest retrieved the bottom half of her body, impregnated it, and put it in the river to preserve the womb for 9 months until his heir was born. That's the type of stories that Dr. Williams used to like to write. Now, you can get this book on the internet for $3,500. It's still available. Now, Dr. Williams also was a businessman. He was a good friend of Fred Isenring, and he dabbled in real estate with him. And there is some question about some of the real estate dealings that they were involved in. The Pabst Brewing Company filed a lawsuit against Fred Isenring at one point, alleging that Fred had transferred properties to Dr. Williams for the purpose of reducing his assets to avoid payment to Pabst. We don't know if this was how this case was resolved, but it certainly shows that they worked closely together with real estate, and sometimes the real estate dealings weren't always on the up and up. Now, this person is A. Cressy Morrison. The A stands for Abraham, but he went by A. Like F. Scott Fitzgerald, he went by A. Cressy Morrison. And A. Cressy Morrison might be the most famous person that you've ever heard of. This guy was multi-talented with a number of diverse interests. He originally came from Massachusetts. He was born there in 1864, but when he was 12 years old, his family suffered a number of financial problems. He had to quit school and go to work. So he did everything. He worked as a janitor. He worked as a salesman. He sold machinery. He sold tools. He sold wool, rubber. He sold molasses and syrup. He worked in a lawyer's office. He worked in a hotel. Finally, one day he got a job in the pharmaceutical business, and That preceded him coming to Whitefish Bay at the age of 23 to become the advertising and publicity manager for the Pabst Brewing Company. So he spent quite a bit of time here as a young executive for the Pabst Brewing Company. He had a number of passions, and one of them was bicycling. And he was involved in the American League of Wheelmen, Wisconsin Wheelmen's Association. He helped the wheelmen use this building at 415 East Day, which is now a residence, as their clubhouse. This building was originally built as a social structure before it became a residence. Cressy lived in this building on Bay Avenue, and he lived there before the dormer was put on later. He just lived there with the roof on the door. And this was his summer cottage while he lived in Milwaukee. Now, he later moved back to New York. He became an executive with the Union Carbide Company, but he also joined an association called the New York Academy of Sciences in 1924, and he became its president 12 years later. And while he was there, an award was established called the A. Cressy Award for Scientific Achievement. And it was awarded annually to anybody in the United States who had developed a breakthrough, a scientific breakthrough. And about 8 of the winners of the Cressy Award ended up becoming Nobel Prize winners. So this was a significant award, and it continued to be awarded by the New York Academy until the mid-90s. Cressy wrote extensively, was widely published. He wrote several books. He wrote many articles, including a history of Milwaukee and a history of the brewing industry. But one of the publications that he's best known for is an essay he wrote entitled 7 Reasons Why a Scientist Believes in God. It's an essay that's quoted today by both believers and non-believers to substantiate both sides. And he passed away in 1951 in New York City. Now we get to 2 of my favorite people that Tom and I had the joy of researching. There are 2 sisters that come from Whitefish Bay who probably have had the most incongruous life of anyone in the Bay. They're Bernardine and Jennifer Dohrn. This is Bernardine's high school graduation picture. And Bernardine and her sister, who were about 4 years apart in age, were bright, talented, active, social students in Whitefish Bay. They were both in the National Honor Society. Their sister, Jennifer, was class valedictorian. They were involved in numerous sports and club activities. Bernardine was a cheerleader. She was a member of the dance club. She was editor of the school paper. She was selected for Badger Girls, which is a Badger Girls State, which is a leadership program run by the American Legion Women's Auxiliary. They were both model students. Yet a few years after Bernardine graduated from high school, she was on the FBI's most wanted list. She had become a political activist, and she had been involved in bombings in New York City, the Pentagon, and the U.S. Capitol. And interesting, after being in hiding for 10 years, she finally turned herself in. She never spent a single day in jail for any of the crimes for which the FBI was pursuing her. And the interesting irony that came out of this is that the FBI deputy director that was pursuing Bernardine Dohrn, ended up being convicted of a felony for crimes that he committed against Jennifer in his zeal to try to catch Bernardine. So Bernardine was born in 1942. Jennifer was born 3 years later. Back up here a second. We lived in this house on Hollwood, 4736 North Hollywood Avenue. Simple, 6-room home. This is Bernardine in her FBI Most Wanted picture file. But Bernardine graduated with honors from Whitefish Bay High School and then went off to college. And you ask yourself, what happened between high school and college that turned her into such a political activist? I have a theory, and I think it comes down to two things that happened in her life in short order, virtually back to back. One was that when between her junior and senior year in high school, Bernardine, and her father's name was Bernard, so she wasn't Bernardine, she was Bernardine. Her dad changed his name from Bernardine Ornstein, O-H-R-N Steen, Dohrn. He dropped the Steen, and he added the D to the O-H-R-N, anglicizing his name. Her father was Jewish, and her mother was of Swedish descent, and she was a practicing Christian Scientist. That had to be a bewildering thing to have happen between your junior and senior year. What was her father was obviously trying to back away from his Jewish heritage. What was the matter with being Jewish? Well, she found out a year later. She went to the University of Miami University of Ohio, in the school in north of Cincinnati in Oxford, Ohio. And again, remember, this is a model student, talented, very involved in social activities, and she rushed a well-known hoity-toity sorority that she badly wanted to be a member of. Well, she was blackballed because her father was Jewish. She was not permitted to join the sorority. So the following year, Bernardine transfers out of the Miami University of Ohio to the University of Chicago. Different climate. Miami University of Ohio is a campus of about 15,000 students in a town that's about half again as large as Whitefish Bay. University of Chicago was a hotbed in the 1960s of student unrest. And she immediately dives into that with both feet. And so she began to walk around campus in thigh-high black boots, tight black leather miniskirts, and bomber's jackets. She was quite the radical hottie. And she wore buttons that had offensive language really intended to outrage. She became active in politics at that point. She graduated with honors and went on to law school and graduated from the University of Chicago Law School. She became involved with Martin Luther King and worked with Martin Luther King in some of his campaign, his political work. She became involved with the Students for a Democratic Society called the SDS, and then with the man that would become her future husband, Bill Ayers, they created a splitter group called the Weather Underground. And it was dedicated to violent action as opposed to political advocacy. Bernardine began writing treatises. She called herself a revolutionary communist. She issued a declaration of war against the United States. And what followed from all that was a series of bombings of the U.S. Capitol, the Pentagon, and New York police stations. Bombings in which, fortunately, no one ever died. Property damage, but no fatalities and no injuries. But they ended up on the FBI's most wanted list. That's her there. And she and her husband, Bill Ayers, were underground for 10 years. They finally turned themselves in 1980. And all the charges against a big ton of criminal charges have been filed against both of them over the years. But in the end, the charges were dropped against Bill Ayers. And the charges against Bernardine were aggravated battery and bail jumping, both misdemeanors, for which she paid a $1,500 fine and served 3 years probation, but no jail time. Now, meanwhile, while all this is going on, here's Bernardine when she turned herself in to the police. Not the sweet Nancy North Shore she might have been destined to be. Jennifer, meanwhile, graduated from Whitefish Bay High School, was the valedictorian of her class, went to Hunter's College in New York, where she got a bachelor's degree, then went to Columbia University in New York, where she got master's degrees and a PhD in nursing. But during this time, she also became very politically active. And she was involved in a national organization that was an above-ground support group for the Weather Underground. And whenever Bernardine had anything that she wanted to say publicly, Jennifer would be her spokesperson, would be her mouthpiece. So Jennifer frequently appears in the media talking for Bernardine. So the FBI did surveillance on Jennifer. And the deputy director that directed that surveillance was a guy named Mark Felt. Mark Felt later was revealed to be deep-throated in the Watergate investigation for Washington Post. So later, after Bernardine turned herself in and the extent of the surveillance became known, Mark Felt was prosecuted, and he was convicted of a felony for violating the civil rights of Jennifer and her associates by breaking into their homes and their apartments to see if they could find information about where Bernardine and others were. Now, President Reagan pardoned Mark Felt, so he never served any real time. One thing that happened is that Jennifer, under the Freedom of Information Act, got all her FBI files and reviewed them. And one thing that they showed is that part of Mark Felt's plot to capture Bernardine was to kidnap Jennifer's newborn baby and hold it for ransom until Bernardine turned herself in. They planned it, but they never executed that plan. Now, amazingly, both these ladies have turned their lives around. Their lives have gone 360 degrees. They started out as model students, became political activists, never really deviated from political activism, but had successful professional and respected careers. Bernardine went to work for a very prestigious Chicago law firm, and then for the next 20 years, 30 years, went to join the faculty of Northwestern University School of Law. And she also became involved in setting up an activist organization, a human service organization, might be a better description, that was set up to help disadvantaged children and their mothers in legal issues in the Chicago community. Jennifer, she is on the faculty of the School of Nursing at Columbia University. She's involved in AIDS projects around the world, program that she runs for Columbia University. Both women are now in their 70s. One thing that was interesting when we were looking this up is that Bernardine, she became the teacher, and Jennifer, she became a nurse. But when they were students at Whitefish Bay, Bernardine was a member of Future Nurses of America, and Jennifer was a member of Future Teachers of America. So they just flipped, just switched. Now, Hollwood owes a big debt to Whitefish Bay in the number of performers that have come out of this community and hit the big time. We've seen a lot of high school graduates and others who have passed through Whitefish Bay, and some of the names that you might be familiar with include Tom Miller, who was a producer of Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley. The Laverne and Shirley was named for his mother Laverne and his aunt Shirley. That's how that title was developed. He grew up on Bay Ridge and went to university school, not Whitefish Bay High School. And he went to Hollwood, was involved with the director Billy Wilder as one of his assistants, and then established his own production company. And one of his first associates was a guy named Gary Marshall. And their first project in 1972 was to develop a sitcom called Bee and the Chimp. And that comedy is widely considered by critics to be one of the worst TV shows in American history. Now, the next year, they did Happy Days, and then the rest is history. And Tom Miller actually was a prolific producer of sitcoms. And at one point earlier in his career, He had 6 sitcoms on all the networks running at one time. He's still producing sitcoms to this day. Another actor is Chip Zahn. Chip is a well-known character actor who's been on Broadway, in movies, and on TV. He got his start when he was an 8-year-old boy as an actor at the Melody Top Theater out on Good Hope Road doing summer stock. Another is Caitlin O'Heaney. Her real name is Kathleen Heaney. She changed it to Caitlin. She lived on Oakland Avenue when she was a child. She went to Cumberland School, graduated from Whitefish Bay, ended up going to Juilliard on a scholarship there. And she's appeared in numerous TV shows and films and was a favorite of Woody Allen. She's appeared in several Woody Allen movies. She was a model for Salvador Dali for a while until Dali's wife objected to her continuing to be a model. And she's a direct descendant of Jacob Best, which is the brewery that he created that became the Pabst Brewery. Some of you may have heard of Sam Elliott, who now goes by the professional name of Sam Page. He is the son of Robert Elliott, who's a prominent attorney in town, was a municipal judge in Whitefish Bay for 15 years. After he graduated from high school, Sam went off to Princeton, got a degree in biology, and decided he wanted to be an actor. And so he moved to Hollywood, and he's had great success. Among the TV programs, the shows he's been involved in are Mad Men, Desperate Housewives, Scandal, House of Cards, and others. I saw a movie that he did on the Hallmark Channel over Christmas, just a few months ago. Another performer you may have heard of is Sid Stone. You have to have lived in Milwaukee to recognize Sid Stone's name. But this is a guy of immense talent too. Probably one of the wittiest people ever to come out of Whitefish Bay. This was a guy that was a painter in his early life, became a salesman, then a cartoonist. He was on a TV show. He became a TV producer. He became an advertising man. Then he finally ended his career as a real estate developer. He did a lot. When he started out, early in Milwaukee, he created a cartoon called Chester the Buck, which ran in the Milwaukee Journal and was syndicated nationwide. And then for many years, he was on WTMJ TV program called It's a Draw, which was a form of charades. He would have a panel of guests and celebrities, and he would draw a cartoon. And the idea was for the celebrities to guess the word that was to be identified with that cartoon. For example, he might draw a lion, then he would add a top hat, then he would add a monocle, then he would add a cane. That was a dandelion. The flower. That type of, to tell the truth, what's my line, those were the type of shows that were popular during that era, and he was involved in that. His wife also her name was Shana, also was an important person too. She became a TV producer alongside him, and they co-produced many shows. One of them was the Gretchen Kolnick show. Cyrus Kolnick was an iron worker, an artisan in this community for many years. Many grand homes in Milwaukee are decorated with the ironworks that Cyrus Kolnick did. His daughter got into TV, and the Gretchen Kolnick show, which Sid and his wife produced, is the longest running non-news program in Milwaukee TV history. There's a guy named Clement Hugh Hickey. Clement Hugh Hickey was an orthopedic surgeon. He never appeared in a single TV show. He was not in the movies. He never was involved in stage production. He was a surgeon. But he was a surgeon in Korea in a MASH unit during the Korean War. And one of his best friends and fellow surgeons was a guy that wrote the book that inspired the movie MASH and the TV series. We don't know which character, whether he's Hawkeye or Trapper or Duke. Which one is Hugh Hickey? He never said. One of the things he did reveal was that the character of Hotman Houlihan, she was a real person. She existed. That wasn't a made-up character for MASH. But the people I want to talk about next are 4 actors that I think had especially noteworthy and interesting careers. This person, you may recognize him. That's Henry Herman McKinney's Jr. Ring any bells? How about Jeffrey Hunter? That's better, right? Well, this is Herman when he was in high school. This is his class yearbook picture. You may know him better here in his role as King of Kings, as Jesus Christ and King of Kings. Now, Jeffrey Hunter in high school would be what you call your classic big man on campus, the MOC. He was student council president, was captain of the football team, he was always the lead in the school plays, he was an honor student, very bright. He had everything going for him. You know, movie star looks, very talented and very smart. And he got involved in drama fairly early on, not just in school plays, but in productions on the North Shore, and called the North Shore Children's Theater. And he even did radio actor work for WTMJ. And when he graduated from high school, he attended Northwestern University, which has a very well-known acting program. He got his bachelor's degree there in 1949. And he studied under a woman named Elvina Prowse, whose students included people like Charlton Heston, Tony Randall, Clara Street Leishman, Claude Akers, Jerry Orbach, Anne Margaret, and Warren Beatty. These were some of her students. Well, Elvina Prowse said years later that Jeffrey Hunter was the most talented student that she had ever had, all of her years of teaching at Northwestern. Jeffrey Hunter, after graduating from Northwestern, went to UCLA to get his master's degree. It was while he was involved in school production there that he was discovered by Hollwood. And in his first movie, in which he appeared in a role with Charlton Heston, the studio head, Daryl Zanuck, said, "We're going to change your name from Henry McKinney's to Jeffrey Hunter." So that became his name. And his children are named Hunter, not McKinney's. So he began to rise as a star quickly in Hollywood, and one of his more famous roles was the movie with John Wayne called The Searchers, where he really made his mark. And then another important movie was one called Hell to Eternity, and another important film for him. He appeared in this movie. This is called King of Kings. This is probably his most well-known role. But it's not considered his best work. In the end, he was involved in 35 films over a 20-year career. Now, at one point, he made a fateful decision about his career. He appeared in the TV Western for 2 years, and he was then cast as the captain of the Star Trek, of the Starship Enterprise, Star Trek. And they cut the pilot. But after they did the pilot, he decided that he did not want this role any longer, and he wanted to concentrate on a movie career. So he left Star Trek. So the role, they had to find another actor to take his place, and they came across William Shatner, who played James Kirk on Star Trek, a role for which William Shatner will always be identified. Jeffrey Hunter died in 1969 after a series of medical problems that were almost as dramatic as his movie career. He was in Spain shooting a film when there was an accident involving an explosion, an on-set explosion that caused a number of lacerations and powder burns to him. Later on, he was involved in a movie in a fight scene where somebody landed a punch on him successfully, rather than phantomly, backed him into a door where he cracked his head. He had to fly back to the States for treatment, during which he suffered a stroke. He recovered and was at his home when he suffered a second stroke, fell down some stairs, hit his head against the stairs, never regained consciousness, and died at the young age of 42. Tragic loss. This is the home he grew up in, and it's at it's on Larkin Street at 4967 North Larkin, just 2 doors down from Fairmont. Now, another actor that had a short life but well-known career was Kristen Johnston. Kristen actually grew up, spent much of her early years, childhood years in Fox Point. That's where her parents lived. Her dad was a state attorney and a state senator, Rod Johnston. But they got a divorce, and so her mother moved to Whitefish Bay in a house at 4716 North Wilshire. This is Kristen's high school graduation picture. Here's a more recent photo of Kristen. And here's the home where she and her mother lived. Kristen graduated from Whitefish Bay High School in 1985 and then went to New York University, New York City, where she got a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in theater. And she began to go to work in Hollywood. Probably the role that she's most identified with is the one of Sally Solomon, a situation comedy, a TV series called Third Rock from the Sun, for which she twice won Emmy Awards. She ended up appearing in 16 films, 18 TV series, and 10 stage productions. But like Jeffrey Hunter, she had a promising career that was cut short. In 2013, she was diagnosed with lupus, and so she suffers from muscle weakness, has difficulty walking, has to wear a neck brace to keep her head erect. So she's no longer doing any acting. She's now committed her life to social causes. She wrote an autobiography in 2012. The title of it was called Guts: The Endless Follies and Tiny Triumphs of a Great Disaster, of a Grand Disaster. In that autobiography, she reveals that she was addicted to alcohol and pills from high school on, although she's been sober since 2008. She used her experiences to establish a charity in New York called SLAM, S-L-A-M, NYC, New York City. The letters SLAM stand for Sobriety, Learning, and Motivation. And it mentors young New York City high school girls with addiction and self-esteem issues. Now, an interesting story about Angela Johnson, Kristen's mother, is that when she purchased this home, she was divorced now. She married again, and she married somebody named Robert Caulfield, who was the executive director of Milwaukee, then purchased a Stradivarius violin. She subsequently sold it a few years later to an anonymous buyer for about $2 million. Now, you may remember in 2014 there was an incident where a Milwaukee musician playing in Wauwatosa was walking back to his car at night when there was an armed robbery, and the Stradivarius that he was playing was stolen. The newspaper story said that violin was owned by an anonymous donor. So it's possible. We're not certain, but it's possible. It was the same violin that Kristen's mother owned at one time. Now, another interesting story about this house is that the architect, his name was Roy Otto, he built it in 1929 for a businessman named Whitney Eastman. Whitney Eastman became involved in the Archer Daniel Midlands Company, ADM. National company. Roy Otto was the architect that built this. He also was the architect for about 12 homes in the Washington Highlands neighborhood of Wauwatosa. Some of you may be familiar with Washington Highlands, a beautiful neighborhood. But despite this promising career as an architect and the success he'd already enjoyed, he quit the architecture business to follow his true passion, which was bowling. He ended up purchasing 3 bowling alleys, and he became the director of the Wisconsin Bowling Proprietors Association. So to go from this home to the bowling alley is a career path that he chose. Now, after Jeffrey Hunter, probably one of the most famous actors to come out of Whitefish Bay is Colleen Dewhurst. Now, to say she was a Whitefish Bay girl might be a bit of a stretch, because this is a picture of her from the yearbook her sophomore year. She was born in Montreal. Her dad was a professional hockey player and a Canadian football player. But after his career, he became a store manager, and they traveled several places: Boston, New York, ending up here in Milwaukee, in Whitefish Bay. And she went to school at Whitefish Bay High School her freshman and sophomore year. Then, her junior year, she was at Shorewood High School. Then her senior year, she was at Riverside High School on Oakland Avenue, where she graduated. Then she went to Milwaukee Downor College, which is now part of UWM, for 2 years. So he's definitely a North Shore. He's partly Whitefish Bay contributed too. So she went to New York. She decided to leave Downor College and go to New York, and went to a drama school there. And it was the American Academy of Dramatic Arts where she went. And while she was there, it was a bit of a struggle. She had to work as a receptionist. She worked as an elevator operator. She worked as a telephone switchboard operator. In between these jobs, she would do summer stock theater from New England to the South. But finally, she became noticed and recognized. She has historically, as an actress, been identified with a lot of Eugene O'Neill plays. But she was doing a Shakespeare play, Antony and Cleopatra, when she met her future husband, George C. Scott, the guy that's probably best known for playing Patton in the movie Patton. And she married and divorced him twice. She said later on that the relationship that she and George C. Scott had were, we made a better brother and sister than we did married couple. During her long career, she won 2 off-Broadway Obie Awards. She won 2 on-Broadway Tony Awards. She was nominated for a Tonys 8 times. She appeared in 56 films, including The Nun Story and Annie Hall. And she spent 33 years on TV, earning 4 Emmy Awards during that. And one of her last performances was as the worldly mother of Murphy Brown, the sitcom that featured Candace Bergen in the title role. She died of cervical cancer in 1991. Colleen Dewhurst was a devout Christian Scientist, so she refused all treatment and died of cervical cancer at the age of 67. Now, she was an actress, but one of her most difficult roles probably was when she became president of the Actors Union, called the Actors Equities Association, a union for stage actors in New York City and Broadway. In 1990, she was widely criticized for objecting to a white British actor playing the role of an Asian man in the musical Miss Saigon. She called that a minstrel show, and thought it was, that an Asian actor should play that role. The union opposed it, but eventually they changed their mind, and the British actor who won that role ended up winning a Tony Award for his performance in that musical. That happened a year before her death, and it probably hastened her death. You have to wonder, though, has anybody here seen Hamilton? In Hamilton, the play about Alexander Hamilton, all of the actors of the Founding Fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Burr, James Madison, they're all played by African American actors. What would Colleen Dewhurst say to that? This is the home that Colleen's family lived in at 5139-69 North Cumberland. It's a duplex today. 5139 North Cumberland was the home where Colleen Dewhurst spent her high school years. This is Jane Archer, and she was an actress that had a life story that should have been on Broadway. She was involved in a wartime romance. She was stranded behind enemy lines during World War II, and she became friends with some of the most famous people on stage and screen of her day. She was born in Connecticut in 1910, yes, and for many years she was a performer on Broadway and in Europe. And she and her husband, Horst Schilbach, eventually settled in Whitefish Bay when they came to the United States after World War II. And they lived for nearly 50 years in this house at 5251 North Michael Wild Avenue. Now, when Archer was in her 20s, she went to Vienna, and she went to an acting school there, the Max Reinhardt School of Acting, where one of her instructors was Otto Preminger, who came to the United States later to become a famous movie director as well as a stage director. She became tight friends with Otto. She taught him English while he taught her acting. And later, when they both came to the United States, he directed her in several plays. While she was a student, she met an engineer named Horst Schilbach, who was a student at the time at the University of Munich. When Archer returned to the United States and was involved in the plays with Otto Preminger and others, she acted on Broadway with Helen Hayes and Lynn Fontaine, Alfred Lunt, and other stars, but she maintained a long-distance relationship with Schilbach. So she returned to Germany in 1938 to marry him. But while she was there, they were living in Berlin at the time. She took a job with an English repertory company, intending to be there only a short time before they would both go to the United States. When the World War II broke out. Now, Schilbach was a research engineer, so the Nazis would not let him leave. So they were stranded in Germany for the duration of the war. They endured bombings of their neighborhood and Schilbach's workplace and the factory that he worked in. And as the Soviets moved towards Berlin, the Russians moved towards Berlin, they were able to escape to Munich and eventually leave Berlin and eventually come to the United States in 1945. They settled at this home on Idlewild Avenue, and for many years after that, Jane Archer did a one-man show called Helen Hayes, Life, Career Roles, in which she would tell details of Helen Hayes' life and dramatize scenes from some of her plays. It's somewhat similar to the actor Hal Holbrook doing one-man shows about Mark Twain. And Schilbach got a job at Allen Bradley Corporation, now Rockwell, and Jane Archer died in 1999, and then Schilbach died in 2002. The final person I want to tell you about is this lady, to which Tom and I and the Historic Preservation Commission owe a big debt. It's Mimi Bird. And Mimi was born in 1933 to Video and Opal Young. And she grew up at a home at 5142 North Idlewild. This was her childhood home. This is a picture of her after she got married to John Bird with her son David. She has two sons. And she graduated from Whitefish Bay High School in 1950. And she became interested in genealogy and joined the Whitefish Bay Historical Society, and that awakened her interest in history. And she took it on herself to begin to research the history of Whitefish Bay from 1892 to 1950, the year that she graduated. And then she expanded her research to include the town of Milwaukee, which is the area that includes the North Shore suburbs along the northeastern part of Milwaukee County, and the town of Granville, which before it was incorporated in Milwaukee County was a freestanding township. And she assembled 27 volumes of newspaper articles, letters, photographs, notes of all kinds that are stored at the Whitefish Bay Library. And the Civic Foundation a few years ago paid for all all of her work be collected and stored and kept safely in the reference library section under lock and key so that it would not disappear. And then her family, alongside with the grant that we were able to obtain, contributed to a project where all of her files were digitized and put on the internet. So you can find out anything you wish to know that at least that Mimi may have about Whitefish Bay, either by the name of the owner or by the property address. And a lot of the work that Tom and I have done really stands on the shoulders of Mimi Bird. And I think future generations really will find everything that she's done for Whitefish Bay valuable research. So, just a quick note that we are involved in a sidewalk, we are involved in the medallion program, which we place medallions in the sidewalks of homes. Some of you may have noticed them. They're scattered throughout Whitefish Bay. There's roughly 250 of them that will be in place by the end of this summer. They are mounted in conjunction with the city's sidewalk improvement program, which moves through the village on a 5-year cycle. When the sidewalk paths are replaced, we try to take advantage of that to plant a medallion in front of homes that our officials recognize as being historically significant in Whitefish Bay. It's an educational and informative program. It has no special status or impact on the property other than to honor the homeowners for doing a good work of maintaining the property. You can get more information about the properties that are on the architecture historic inventory, we call it. It's the medallion properties. And we have a map on the web. And if you have a QR code reader on your smartphone, you take a picture of this, you will be linked by your smartphone to a map that will show you where the various properties are that have received medallions and give you a short history of those properties. So it's something we're trying to continue to do to educate the people of Whitefish Bay, the residents of Whitefish Bay, about the history of our community. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Any stories about cradles?
Cradles is an historic district. It's determined by the state. And the story behind it is after World War II, the area was zoned for multifamily. And Schradel purchased the property and wanted to build an apartment complex. Also developing at that time was a lot of single-family housing after the war. So the village board decided that it wanted to not allow multifamily housing and make it a single-family neighborhood. In Schradel's case, he contested that. They rezoned the property after he had purchased it. He took it to court, and it went all the way to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court found in his favor that this action by the Whitefish Bay village government rezoning the property after it had been purchased by Schradel violated his rights. So he developed the Bay Village apartment complex. That complex, along with a couple of other apartments and the condo units that are part of that neighborhood, have been determined to be a proposed residential historic district by the State Historic Society.